Texas.
Thank
I
you, Madam
stuttered
President.
a little bit there, pardon me.
Madam President, in June, our Democratic colleagues voted on their first and initial efforts to nationalize our state-run and local-run election system. This bill, this legislation, this effort had been years in the making. You know, in some ways, it's interesting to think about because back when our country was founded, there was a big debate on whether we should have a national government or whether we should have a federal system. And of course, we opted for a federal system where the states retained their sovereignty within their authority and all powers not delegated to the federal government were retained by the states and the people. That's the very definition of a federal system. So our colleagues on the Democratic side of the aisle have sort of renewed that debate again and trying to upend our federal system of governance in favor of a national government, basically a command and control run out of Washington, D.C. And when it comes to the takeover of our elections or to try to nationalize our elections, the initial proposal surfaced as a messaging bill in 2019, but over the years has undergone a number of makeovers. Each time our colleagues have tried to sell this radical change in the way that our elections is run by different appeals. They talked about, well, this is important for election security. Remember the 2016 election, obviously, big concerns about Russian misinformation campaigns and cyber attacks and election security was obviously top of mind. And then it was sold as a matter of regaining the voters' confidence that their vote would actually count. Then it was sold as a way to remove the obstacles that prevented people from voting, which appears to be the current message. Well, in 2020, in my state alone, but not just in Texas, but across the country, we saw a record voter turnout. In my state, we said 66% of registered voters cast a ballot, 11.3 million people. The last time I had been on the ballot, 6 years previously, we only had 4.8 million voters. But we went from 4.8 to 11.3 in just 6 years. Now, part of that's because my state's been growing. Between 2010 and 2020, we've seen 4 million new Texans, either born or moved or made their way one way or another to our state. But the 2020 election saw the largest voter turnout in 120 years. 120 years. Well, clearly, if people are voting, including people of color, minorities, are voting at record levels, it's time to come up with a new sales pitch to try to sell this hijacking, really, of our state and local run elections. So a number of states, including my state, have recently passed legislation to address voter confidence, to make sure that elections are fair and that people have an opportunity to vote who are legally qualified to do so. The phrase many of them used in that process was they tried to make it easier to vote and harder to cheat. So that now has been the focus of our Democratic colleagues in trying to nationalize our state and local run elections, which, by the way, is ensconced within the framework of the Constitution itself. So our Democratic colleagues then attacked these state election laws and really just went over the top in terms of their description of what exactly was happening. Certainly, it was not factual, but they said in a number of cases, these changes in state election laws, and I'm thinking of Georgia, Arizona, and Texas in particular, they said they're the most sweeping attacks on the right to vote since the beginning of Jim Crow. And they said the only way to change that was to pass their election law. Our colleagues talked about the bill in terms of protecting the right to vote and strengthening our democracy. Who could be against that? But the reality of the situation is very different, and the far-reaching provisions of the Democrat election takeover bill looks nothing like the safeguards of democracy. It looks more like a partisan power play. So in the end, the only thing bipartisan about the bill was the opposition. In both the House and Senate, Republicans and Democrats voted against the initial legislation, but our Democrat colleagues still refused to recognize the reality of the vote and throw in the towel. So after the failed vote this summer, our colleagues on the Democratic side went back to the drawing board and came back with a new bill they call the Freedom to Vote Act. Well, if we needed any more proof that this is not a good faith effort to strengthen our elections, but rather a partisan power play, the bill was introduced 1 week ago, and the Senate could end up voting on it as early as this week. That's hardly what I would call a deliberative process, or one that even invites bipartisan debate and consideration. So we may end up being required to vote on the bill. That's certainly the prerogative of the majority leader, with no real committee hearings, no real testimony from experts, and no indication that this bill is really being taken seriously other than to check a box and to send a message. What's really been interesting is our colleagues on the left have said they've tried to brand this as a compromise bill. I think that's primarily because of the objection of the senator from West Virginia, Senator Manchin, who said he couldn't support the original bill, so they tried to come up with something that maybe looked more like a compromise, but really isn't. And I'll talk about that more in a second. But this bill is not the result of bipartisan deliberations or consultation or communication even. As the Republican leader has noted, this so-called compromise bill is a compromise between the left and the radical left, which is hardly a compromise at all. But that's apparently the way that Leader Schumer decides to run the Senate, after all, passing a $1.9 trillion spending bill right after Joe Biden became president with no Republican support, under the auspices of being COVID relief, when only 10% of it was actually had anything to do with COVID. Well, the good news is we've done a few bipartisan things. We passed the Endless Frontiers Act, our way of trying to address the challenge of China. We passed a bipartisan infrastructure bill. But now our colleagues on the other side of the aisle want to do it alone again, and they're trying to pass a bill that could end up costing taxpayers as much as $5.5 trillion. The nominal figure is $3.5 trillion, but right now they're experiencing a lot of differences of opinion within their own ranks as to what's acceptable and what's not, and they certainly aren't talking to us. But all the while, they've continued to work on a partisan effort to overrun our constitutional delegation, really, of the election system to state and local government. So no one should be fooled. This bill is not a compromise in any sense of the word. Just like its predecessor, this bill hijacks state constitutional power to make decisions on things like voter registration and early voting. Actually, this morning in the Constitution Subcommittee, the senator from Connecticut, Senator Blumenthal, was talking about the fact that his state, Connecticut, did not have early in-person voting, but they had now passed a bill which provides for a referendum in Connecticut, and then if the referendum passes, then the state legislature may actually provide for early voting in person. I would just tell you that the contrast between the rhetoric and the reality is pretty amazing, because the Texas election law passed by the state legislature just recently provides for 17 days of early voting in person. In other words, there is a fulsome opportunity for anybody who's qualified to vote to cast their ballot in person, or by mail if you qualify, or on the day of the election. And as you can see, with 66% of the registered voters actually taking advantage of that generous opportunity to cast their ballot, they did in historic numbers. Well, there's a saying that if it's not broke, don't fix it. And there's nothing broke about our state and local run election systems. Oh, certainly the guardrails are in place. If, for example, someone were to deny a minority voter the opportunity to cast a ballot, or to make sure their ballot counted just like anybody else, there's Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And in fact, the Biden Department of Justice has filed such a lawsuit against Georgia based on the changes in their voting laws. So there's plenty of opportunity to raise these issues in court should the federal government and should the Biden administration wish to challenge them. But the truth is they're going to lose, because what they've tried to do is to change through litigation what they cannot do constitutionally through legislation. Well, this so-called compromise bill, which is no compromise at all, contains invasive disclosure requirements that would attack the privacy of voters and chill free speech. It places handcuffs on states when it comes to drawing new legislative lines in redistricting, and it threatens action from the Attorney General if those standards aren't met. It makes it too difficult to root out fraud and protect the integrity of the vote by prohibiting voter ID for mail-in ballots and mandating drop boxes for ballots to be dropped by partisan advocates. You know, we've had people act like there's no such thing as voter fraud, but actually we have a famous case in Texas called Box 13 in Duval County, Texas, where Coke Stevenson and LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, were running for the Senate. And you know what they found is, because of the manipulation of the voter rolls by the county judge in Duval County, literally they had people who were already buried in the cemetery vote in favor of Lyndon Baines Johnson in an alphabetical order once they figured out how many votes they needed to cast. That's just one famous example of voter fraud, and our Democratic colleagues act like it doesn't exist. But what we did hear in the Judiciary Committee a few months ago was the Secretary of State for New Hampshire. He's a Democrat, and they don't have any early voting. And it was interesting to hear him say that he thinks the single most important factor when it comes to people casting their ballot is people's confidence in the system, that their ballot will actually be counted the way they voted it. And so all of these different times and conditions under which people can cast their ballot, he says, really don't have nearly as big an impact as just the confidence they have that their vote will be counted as they cast it. And why our Democratic colleagues are opposed to voter ID is beyond me. We know Jimmy Carter and James Baker III. Of course, Jimmy Carter, a former president, Democrat president, and James Baker III, a former prominent Secretary of State and Treasury Secretary. They had a commission to look at things like voter ID, and they actually recommended that voter ID would be one way to instill public confidence in the integrity of the vote. You got to show your ID when you go through the Transportation Security Administration, TSA, to get on an airplane. You got to show an ID if you're going to buy a pack of cigarettes at a convenience store or a six-pack of beer. I mean, we are accustomed to being able to people being required to identify who they are. If you want to get into a federal building, you have to show an ID. But so the idea that we should prohibit voter ID, to me, is ridiculous. And that's one of the provisions in the Democrat substitute bill, which is before us. It would prohibit the use of voter ID for mail-in ballots. But that's just the beginning. One of the most outlandish, or I should say on top of what I've already talked about, provisions in this bill is the use of taxpayer funds for campaigns. Well, a lot of companies have matching programs for charitable giving. That's a positive, good thing. If an employee donates to a charity of their choice, many times